Welcome to the first in a webinar series with WA Performing Arts Industry. And we've called it a radical rethink for regeneration in WA Performing Arts. And my name is Renée Newman. I start by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land, sky and waters of this place that we all call home. We collectively pay our respect to elders past and present and stand in support of Noongar leaders of the future. In solidarity, we stand in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and uphold the principles of justice, respect and kindness. So, this series, it grew out of a desire to see a conversation that was across performing arts disciplines and across funding tiers. At a truly exhausting rate, the arts have gone online in response to COVID-19. So now this is an opportunity to engage in dialogue, I've lost my notes, to engage in dialogue about future thinking, about post-COVID-19, whatever that looks like, about rebuilding, about refreshing relationships and planting seeds for meaningful change. Today, we begin this session with a stellar lineup. Clare Watson from Black Swan State Theatre Company, Sam Nerida, independent performance maker and co-director of Static Drive, Reece, Perth Festival, Shelagh Magadza of the Chamber of Arts and Culture of WA, Kylie Bracknell, actor, director and Noongar language advocate, and Kelli McCluskey from PVI Collective and co-administrator of the Facebook group Australian Artists Amidst COVID-19, one of the most interesting, supportive and useful advocacy groups that I have ever come across. So the panel have each been given a question to respond to, and at the end of this, we will finish on short remarks about a vision for the future of our hopes and dreams for our sector. Our overarching question is, does COVID-19 demand a radical rethink of the WA performance ecology? I want to start with Shelagh. What can we keep from our time in isolation?
Thanks, Renée. That's a very big question. And I decided to respond today with reflections on 5 themes or points that I have been thinking about a lot in my time in isolation. And they really, I think many of us have kind of been grappling with kind of quite big existential questions over this time. Either because we're forced to spend more time alone with ourselves, but also as a way of somehow framing and processing something that's almost incomprehensible that's gone on around us. And these are the 5 key things that I have kind of come out thinking that I would like to take forward into what the new future is going to be. The first is this proposition about risk, uncertainty, and change. I think we spend a lot of our lives and we construct a lot of our organisations and our societies in a way that tries to mitigate risk, to protect ourselves, to give ourselves certainty into the future, and to, I guess, give ourselves some idea of what we can expect from a life and a social trajectory. But something like this really reminds us that risk is an inherent part of human life, and that we need to understand it and embrace it, and the change that comes with it. It's an opportunity as well as a huge challenge, but our society is perhaps one of the most abnormal societies in that we have had this level of continuity and comfort for a few decades now that has left us possibly a little bit complacent about how transitions, change and risk happen in our societies. But artists have been living in that space for a long time, because that's where a lot of creative practice is based, around taking personal, political, social risks. And so I think this is where we have something to add to a conversation that is quite significant for our society. And we need to think about how we constructively operate in that space, bringing all those skills and tools and reflections into that space to not only, I guess, provide a degree of comfort, but also to continue to challenge people through this process. The second thing that I've been thinking a lot about is our environmental impact, because the pandemic really is a picture of 7.5 billion people on the planet, looks like. And there have been two things about this. One is the reminder of our interconnectedness, that we rely on each other now so greatly globally. We are also intimately connected, and the fortunes of one are the fortunes of others. But also at the same time, it has reminded us what a quieter and less consumptive life could look like. And I think those are both really two important things for us to consider in how we develop our practice going forward, to be responsible within that environment, to do the best we can to think about how we produce work, how we consume work, and what that means for the impact on the planet around us, and I guess the ripple effect also into other societies from here on, and a real reminder that we can't afford to be complacent anymore about our joint presence on this planet and our impact on it. The third thing I have been thinking about is at the opposite end of that spectrum, how we've been forced to turn local. Not only have I not had to put petrol in my car for weeks, but I've enjoyed walking around my neighbourhood. I now know more than I ever did about which trees the birds go to, the trajectory of the sun throughout the day, all many things. But I think the going local also has meant that we need to reflect on our society and our culture, and in particular to turn back to the Indigenous cultures of this land and finish, well, I suppose so in some cases it's actually really even begin the conversation towards a better society in terms of how we place Indigenous cultures, respect them and support them and learn from them to go forward. I think having had some very difficult conversations with people in my neighbourhood around diversity at this time as well, it's an important time to really dig deep into what our community values are and what our, you know, when we're all forced to be in the same space together for this extended period of time, how we actually understand that to work and to be a positive force for change. Particularly, I think, because the idea of community has become so important to people, you know, isolation versus community, and how we support those communities when, in fact, a lot of life before COVID didn't support community very well. It supported a really individualized view of life and very individuated ways of interacting with each other. The third theme, or fourth theme now within that, is an extension of that really, which is I've come to really think hard about a kind of intergenerational tension. And at one end, we've been really made aware of the fragility of our elderly population. And as we are an aging society, this is going to become more and more important about how we care for them, how we reach them, and how we allow them to still stay connected. But also how we value them. I think at a time when they were so, you know, vulnerable, I think a lot of us were reminded of the value of the elderly people in our community, what they mean to us. And I think as we come out of this again, those thoughts about loneliness and people for whom isolation is actually an ongoing, or was even pre-COVID, an issue in their lives, how we can think about that and respond to that into the future. But at the other end of this, when I call it an intergenerational tension, I mean, there's not necessarily tension between generations, but at the other end, I've also become aware through the COVID time of the cohort of people who are emerging into adulthood and working life in our society, and particularly in the arts sector, the under 30s, I would call them, but that's just a random definition, for whom life opportunities are shrinking at a rapid rate. These are people who were struggling before, and it's a long time trend. I think COVID has accelerated something that had already been coming. And today's announcements about the university fees are just like another illustration of a cohort for whom the opportunities, and I guess their understanding of what their potentiality in not only their own lives, but their ability to contribute to society is really, I think, challenged. And I've met a lot of people who feel very disenfranchised, disempowered. They're not included in conversations. They don't share the same access to information. And I just think we need to look at those people really carefully and think about how we care for them and create a life expectancy and a positive way of participating and fulfilling their lives into the future. Because, to damage that optimism and faith in your own life at this point is terrible for consequences for the rest of somebody's life. And then the last thing, which I think is very obvious to all of us, is for those of us who've been dodging the fourth industrial revolution, too late, baby. I was one of the few people I knew who didn't have internet at home pre-COVID. I now have broadband, damn it. But I think, there are many other inevitabilities about the fourth industrial revolution, as we like to call it, that have impacted on our industry in an accelerated way. We knew they were coming. We knew that digital was kind of, a growing threat. We knew that changing consumer behavior was starting to impact on the way our business models functioned. And we knew that the future of work was looking very different, but those have really been brought home in such a huge way in these last couple of months. Some of it is good. I think the opportunities for us to work from home, to be more connected in our family and work life has been fantastic. But I think also as artists and as a sector, we need to get our heads out from under the duvet and start figuring out how we're going to take what we have into this next world and be a positive impact.
Some fantastic thoughts. Thank you. And I think we're all like scribbling notes, trying to think of how we can extend on what you're saying as well. I want to move to Sam Nerida. How do we grow audiences safely, effectively, and respectfully?
Hi. What a question. I think it's a question that every arts organisation, artist, producer is asking themselves on multiple different levels, just from one, like a ticket sales perspective, but also from a impact of the arts and importance of the arts perspective. And I think in answering this, I looked at it quite practically, I guess, from what I've observed and what I've done myself as an artist, but it also really speaks to this radical rethink that I think for our questions of audience development isn't so much inspired by COVID, but it's a good moment to really talk about how much we need to step back and think differently about the way that we present work, the way that we value work, and the way that we expect people to be able to access that without having thought about a lot of those barriers that can exist for communities. And maybe to people who haven't thought about audience development much, who might be listening at a later date, that audience development, I guess, reaching communities that aren't currently represented in our audiences. And those communities, for whatever reason, can be based on access or location or like religious background or whatever it is. And I think a question to do that safely, effectively, respectfully, at the very top, you're asking yourself, why you're wanting to grow that audience and why you're wanting to reach that community in the first place. And if it is just an idea that you want their ticket sales, then perhaps there's not so much safety, effectiveness and respect there. But if you really do believe that you have a piece of art or a piece of performance that you want, that you think has a real value to a community that you want to reach, I think it requires a step back. It requires identifying barriers to access, and then it needs like real resource-backed, embodied research and consultation with that community about what might help them get there. There have been real wonderful examples, I think in Perth recently, of productions and organisations that have done that. To like name a few, the work that Performing Lions did with Layla Majnun last year, and as well as Black Swan and Barking Gecko for Fully Seek, and Perth Festival in Yirrayakan on Hecate, and also inside of that PTT as a venue, I know they were involved in those conversations as well. It was front of house staff training, it was venue changes, like it was looking at, is there a prayer room, like is there alcohol being served, and other barriers not for those specific shows, like what time are the shows on, does it coincide with prayer time, do you have matinees for older generations you're trying to reach, do you have Auslan, do you have audio description, is there childcare? There's just so many, like, is there travel? Is it near a bus station? Can you take the show to that community? Is there a way that you're talking to that community, that you're expecting them to be hearing about the show through traditional means? And I know that Zanab at Performing Lines did such market research with the community she was trying to reach. The ticket price was based on what those people thought were acceptable. There was no lockout because Zanab went, they're not going to come on time, so we can't lock the doors the way we usually would. And there was just such care in the way that the show was bigger than the product. It was a whole experience of community development, of audience development, and it worked, and people came, and it was an experience that was much greater than just buying a ticket to see a show. I think it's also about repeated invitations. Sisonke spoke to this when she was, heading Lit and Ideas at Perth Fest this year, that it happens really slowly, really, really slowly, and you're not going to see results from this work you want to be doing in 1 year. You might see it in 5 or 10, because you might extend the hand and take those barriers away once, but maybe the 5th or 10th or 20th time that invitation will be taken up. And I think that's important to remember, that there's just so much rethinking of things that seem obvious or a given or an absolute. And this digitizing of theatre, I think, has really shown us that the point of live performance is not just to intake the media or that experience or that story, because we can still do that with movies, or I guess we can do that with the theatre that's been filmed and put online, but we can feel that it's different to going to that venue and to being in that audience with a group of people and suspending your distraction for an hour or 2 hours and giving, like, a room of people giving full attention to one point is a rare and beautiful feeling. And I think it's been nice to have that reminder that that's the important part, and the feeling that everyone has, I think, of wanting to get back to that, and how we can get back to that is vital to hold on to. But in that desire, I really want to see, and myself as well, commit to thinking about what can be done differently rather than reverting to a normal, because we know that's not going to happen. Even with the way that audience, like recommendations for venues reopening, is around discouraging socialization pre and post show, which is such a devastating thought. That the idea is you get, herded into the theatre with an appropriate distance, sit far away from people, and have to leave immediately. Just feels like the opposite way that you would want to intake something that is this community viewership experience. There's so much more, I guess, to talk about on a practical level of what audience development and that research and those barriers and those changes can be, but I will leave it there because it's all very big stuff and there's a lot to say.
Thank you, Sam. There is a lot in there, absolutely. Kelli, McCluskey, can we hear from you about how we promote the value of art within government and within our communities?
Sure. Okay, thanks, Renee. Thank you for hosting this discussion. It's great hearing from everyone so far. And I really love how you've tried to frame all of the questions through an optimistic lens, which, did strike me as a bold move. So thank you. I wanted to give my session a title in an attempt to just try to contain my thoughts, because like everyone's, it was a big question. So, okay, my title, I used a quote from a female sci-fi writer called Alexandra Rowland, who in 2017 wrote this: "The opposite of grimdark is hope punk. Pass it on." I'm just gonna look, here we go. The opposite of grimdark is hope punk. Pass it on. Now, I'm hoping this is going to make sense later, but I wanted it to sit there from the get-go. So just to get back to your question, Renée, which was, how do we promote the value of art within government and within community? And so I think, like, pretty much like everyone, I was like, oh, thanks a lot, Renée. Just pull the trigger out of that grenade and hand it over. The value of art in government, in society, 7 minutes. And I felt a bit, you know, crushed under the weight of the question, because I think for me at the moment, when you situate, you know, the word optimism alongside the words government, arts, and value right now, you quickly realize you're going to need to muster, you know, way more than a sense of positivity. You're going to need full scale, tits to the wind, weaponized, militant optimism, because the relationship between government and Australian culture is a really fractured one at the moment. I wanted to quickly give some context as to why I think that is. So I thought I could read out a couple of statements about the state of the arts in Australia right now from my perspective, and maybe each of us on the panel can try to scale our feelings of optimism from 1 to 5. 1 being very little optimism, 5 being the tits to the wind, super optimistic feeling. Okay, so I've got a couple. All right, at a time when the word arts is rapidly disappearing from political portfolios and government policy, resulting in no high-level discussions or interest in discussing the role of arts and culture and its place in Australian society. Now, a scale of 1 to 5, how do we feel about the value of arts in the political sphere at the moment? Maybe hold your fingers up to the screen. There's a 1 there. Yeah, I'm a 1. Sheila's not committing. Sheila's like, oh, it's a 2. Okay.
Go Clare.
Oh, okay, 3. All right, next one. Okay. At a time when COVID-related emergency cash flow support doesn't recognise the freelance nature of the gig economy, when 76% of artists are freelance or employed casually, and when the majority of those casuals identify as women, how optimistic are we feeling about the value of arts within our COVID reality at the moment? I'm gonna get 2. There's a 3. Yeah, people. Okay, 3s and 2s. Last one. At a time when artists are not considered as a workforce by the public or treated like an industry by those in power, even though we employ 4 times more people than the coal mining sector, how optimistic are we feeling about the value of arts within the workforce here? And I'm going to go 2. There's a 1. Oh God, it's 2s and 1s. Yeah, so like you, my optimism scores were quite low, and I'm not sure if any of us are quite ready to rip our shirts off quite yet. So I guess it was, you know, all of those thoughts that kind of came crashing in with Renée's question of the value of arts and how it's regarded by those in power and within the community. And that was my initial negative reaction. And I realized, you know, this is a very dystopic state of mind. And maybe it's a state of mind that's kind of hovered over us for a long time, you know, like capitalism, it's settled in for the long haul and we haven't quite figured out how to shake it off. So we've gotten used to it. And that's our lens now, which is, you know, a catastrophized worldview where, at least in the arts, as a workforce, as an industry, we're not valued, we're invisible, we're worthless, what we do won't make a difference and it doesn't matter. And this is the grimdark from the quote. And it's not a made up word. Well, actually all words are made up, aren't they? But you know, grimdark is actually a literary subgenre of social sci-fi that is like darkly dystopian. So think Black Mirror, George Orwell, Margaret Atwood, Clockwork Orange, there's heaps, we could all think of heaps. And grimdark as a genre gives us like the bleakest of worldviews. Violence and cruelty and corruption is a given. Social systems are in a constant state of peril. It's a very familiar state of being because in my mind, that's how we're viewing the world right now, and it's paralyzing. But to get back to the rest of the quote, the opposite of grimdark is hope punk. Hope, confidence in the future. Punk, disruptive, a form of resistance. And I think all of us, particularly the next generation of makers, really need to start to ground ourselves more in a hope punk worldview. You know, and it's a worldview that argues that, you know, the fight to build positive, equitable social systems is a fight worth having. It's one that champions, respects, and prioritizes First Nation voices and is grounded in that culture. It's one that aggressively chooses kindness and optimism over cynicism and violence. And hope punk, in my mind, is like a call to arms for us to imagine better in order to do better. And I think, you know, art for PVI is inherently political. Art is activism. It can speak to uncomfortable truths in ways that just stay with you. And that matters. That's not worthless. That's actually really powerful. So I was thinking, okay, so the first hope punk action that needs to be taken in Australia means getting back to the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which is an artwork as well as a political document. And it fundamentally situates First Nations culture at the heart of society. You know, and as we all know, through the Magadza Commission, a process of truth-telling about colonisation would happen, a reckoning would happen, hope. Through disruption of constitutional change, a First Nations voice to Parliament would be enshrined permanently. Punk. You know, and I kind of think, you know, without reconciling how we value our First Nations people, their land, their culture, their sovereignty first, we can't begin to fathom how we all value art and culture in Australia. We can't possibly hope to promote anything within our industry on the value of art until this happens, because otherwise, like colonial history, it's all going to be built on a lie. So I guess my provocation to all of us is to be more hope punk and pass it on. That's all I got.
Hope punk. Okay, it's going to be my catch cry. Thank you. Okay, so moving on. Claire Watson. How can we refresh our relationships from training institutions like WAAPA here to the profession to beyond?
Thanks, Renee. And similarly, my first reflection is just what an enormous question that is. And I might reflect on some hope punk offerings in this as well. Thank you so much for that phrase, Kelly. I'll be using that daily now. Look, this moment in time has been referred to by Esther Perel, who many of you would know. She's a psychologist who does a lot of work specifically around relationships and romantic relationships. Her podcasts are fantastic. She spends a lot of time looking at the stories that we bring to our relationships. She has coined the phrase, the great adaptation, for this time. And I think the idea of recognizing that with change is the possibility of complete change is very exciting for us in terms of all of our relationships. We've reflected a little bit on isolation and the manner in which that has impacted on us. And I guess I begin by thinking about relationships interpersonally and very personally. Actually, we've spent a lot of time with ourselves. We've spent more time with our families. There's been a lot of time for reflection and for introspection as a result of that. And I would hope that one of the things that's happened in this time is that we as individuals have gotten more connected to our own sense of personal values, what feels right, what feels like a compromise, and we're getting clearer about listening to those signals in our own bodies and our own selves. I also hope that in terms of people's interpersonal relationships, that's becoming clearer as well, because I think the clearer that is within ourselves personally, the clearer it is interpersonally. And then that brings me to relationships in theatre and in the industry. We're in the business of proximity, and what we do is we come into a room together and we work on a rehearsal room floor together. We respond to one another's bodies and physical energy and breath, and that's part of what drives us as makers. And then we take that into into the theatre itself, and we're in the business of proximity with our audience. Now, I'd always referred to that as the moment of transaction, but isn't it better to think about it as a relationship than as a transaction, and what that relationship is between the artists on stage, the artists who have created the work, and the audience itself. So I think in reframing, in being radical about the way we think about our relationships and the industry, rather than answer this question, I feel like I've got a whole bunch of questions. One of them is, what does a relationship, in this moment of change, in this moment of adaptation, how can we transition our relationship with our audience? My feeling is that the structure that we've been working within expects our audience to sit and listen. They're in the dark. They're often, there's that sort of sense of being, you know, mollified as an audience and receiving and being an empty vessel. And how can we ask our audiences to be active? How can we ask them to participate with us in the storytelling that we're creating? And I guess from a perspective of a curatorial perspective as well, how can we make sure that that's something that is active rather than just being received? I would also question the relationships that we have in terms of the hierarchies that exist within the company structures. So when we talk about major performing arts companies and small to medium performing arts companies, and I could just question the validity of thinking about those structures. I question our relationship to government and to funders. And if you're looking at it from a psychology relationship point of view, I can't help but think he's just not that into you. Like we've got a bit of a relationship problem, you know, we've got a bit of an issue and we need to talk about it. It's something that we really need to navigate. And if we can do that with care, like Sam talked about for our audiences, if we can prioritise, you know, you spoke, Renee, in your opening statement about justice, respect and kindness. I think if we can make sure that we're prioritising values in all of our relationships, including audience, including funders, including even relationships with our corporate sponsors at this time, if what we're doing is making sure that those are really value-based and making sure we're committing to open and generous conversations, I think that this period, this great adaptation, has the possibility to take us to incredible new places as artists and culturally, more generally. And I'd give that definitely a glass half full and a big 5 in terms of hope punk. It's so interesting. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of is reading, and I can highly recommend it to everybody, but reading a lot of Rebecca Solnit. Has anybody else done a bit of that during the pandemic? Yeah. And particularly in terms of reading about sort of theories of hope and how interconnected we all are. I think that the pandemic has perfectly demonstrated both how we can cope as isolated beings, but how we function ecologically, how we can't not be part of a system. And so the questions for me about radically rethinking relationships is how can we each be most responsible for our relationships within that system in order to create a better future and a fairer future and a future that is more based on justice, respect and kindness. And then I guess the question very specifically about what's the relationship between training and professional practice. I repeat the idea in some ways about there's no such thing as an empty vessel. I think that the idea of the idea of sort of shifting the hierarchy from a sense of there are people who are learning and there are people who are doing professionally. I wonder if one of the things that we can reframe in this moment in terms of arts and arts practice is the idea that arts is absolutely fundamental to being human. So while there are some of us who are very lucky that do it professionally as a practice all day, every day, and there are some of us who are, you know, honoured to be studying it, it's actually something that is part of all of us. And if we can find a way of thinking about our industry much more fundamentally in the way that sport can speak to health, I wonder if we get to change our relationships with audience and potentially with our funders as well. So many more questions than answers, but I'm thrilled, Renee, to have had the opportunity to think on it.
Thank you. I think more questions than answers is always the beginning of a great conversation. So may that continue. Reece, what new relationships can be grown in our post-COVID realities?
Oh, thanks, Renee. Yeah, great question. And look, like any cheeky individual, you know, I'd take the question and just twist it a little bit. And also, like Claire, I'm going to pose quite a few questions myself instead of directly answering. But the conversation that I wanted to have is about a relationship with relevance. And I think, you know, I live and breathe and love festivals, and I grew up experiencing firsthand here in this amazing yet very isolated place the feeling of the world coming to Perth through a festival. And through that experience, you know, I gained curiosity and perspective and ambition, and I embraced and I rebelled against the things that I saw or the stories that I heard. And I believe in festivals because festivals need to respond to their community, and they need to respond to their geographical place. And if they don't, they lose their relevance, then they lose their uniqueness, and they offer no connection to their community. And so inevitably they fizzle out, or they should, and they die. And then, you know, I think about that really, and there's just nothing radical about that. And there's nothing that is not applicable there to the broader arts and cultural sector. There's nothing there that's not applicable or not true about the impact and the connection and the relevance theatre or dance or music or literature should have. And so I find it really disturbing at the moment because, you know, a few of us have mentioned this kind of existential crisis. Lots of people are having these thoughts, and I worry about that so much because we're all very deep thinkers and feelers, us arts people, and everything that we do is so deeply connected to our values. And we're all questioning the value that the arts has. And, you know, I Googled the other day whether or not I should retrain as a doctor, and it's going to take me too long, so I'm not going to do it. But I moved through that. And, you know, it's funny and it's not funny, actually, because I'm someone who really believes in the arts and really believes in its relevance. And I'm considering that in my head. And then we now know that we're struggling with our relevance, and we're struggling with this argument to the greater world about our relevance, about the arts and culture relevance. And, you know, a new class system is emerging through COVID. Essential and non-essential workers, and you know, people are labeling themselves as essential or non-essential. You see people labeling themselves on LinkedIn as an essential worker. We're seeing companies using the tagline of essential workforce under their company logos, and I'm seeing us being shifted and shunted into this corner of non-essential. And even today, Shelagh mentioned, you know, in the last 24 hours, our own government is directly insinuating that arts and cultural degrees are of less value. And we should actually pay for that as an indulgent choice that we're making because we're not contributing to a greater community. So I want to talk about growing a relationship with relevance. So I think when considering relevance, I think we need to explore our relationship to each other in the sector first and foremost, actually. And I think we can be really siloed and we can be really insular in how we think and how we work together and how we advocate. And I do think there's work to be done there. But I have a series of questions to pose that I was thinking about in relation to being a young person who is studying in this sector. And you know, the questions that I would like to directly pose to the students of WAAPA and to our community are things like, first and foremost, country and place. If you consider relevance, we need to ensure that we explore our relationship with this place, with this country, and with our country's culture. And we need to ask ourselves, what is the ground that is beneath our feet and how lightly we should be treading on this country? And we need to reflect on our own immediate connection with that land. I think there's a big question about risk and what risk-taking means. And is risk actually literally having more honest and direct conversations? And why are we scared of that? We're the arts and cultural sector, you know, we're about provocation, and we're about dreaming, and we're about storytelling, and we're about representation. And risk seems to be this word that we're bouncing around and dancing around now, but I think actually risk-taking just means being honest. And potentially just leading with our values first. And then I think that draws me to a question of leadership. And, you know, I think it's important that we always ask this question, who is speaking on your behalf? And are you okay with that? And are they representing your beliefs and your values? And if they're not, can you say something? Who are you speaking on behalf of? And is that okay? And were you given permission to speak on behalf of that person or on behalf of that community? And considering what our relationship is to our own voice and our own ability to speak up and to ask those questions and to provoke. What are our own values, and do we use our values to deliver the decisions that we make and to create the relationships and to grow the relationships? And I think, look, that's all a bit, you know, I don't want that to kind of come across as highbrow, deep, late night, you know, thinking in this world of isolation. But I think, you know, this fundamentally, the relationship I believe we need to grow is that one of relevance. And I think we do have to dig deeper and challenge ourselves. And I think this idea of not being siloed as an industry starts in these institutions. You know, it starts with walking through the quadrangle or whatever at WAAPA, and the dancers sitting on one side and the music students sitting on the other side. And, you know, like how those two groups of people and those two sectors interrelate right there and then, and how that can shift and change right here at WAAPA now with young people who are responsible for taking this industry and taking these conversations further. And I want everyone to believe that our workforce, this beautiful arts and cultural sector, is relevant and is essential. And I think that does begin at the top. And you know, we're hopefully questioning what the top looks like and some of these bigger power structures and institutions. But, you know, I would love to see us grow relationships with those broader communities. And I would love to know when big arts organisations and little arts organisations can have scientists and Noongar elders and doctors and agricultural specialists on their boards, because we currently are drawn to accountants and lawyers and corporate organisations, and they serve a purpose. But if we want our organisations and our art to remain relevant, and we want to grow a relationship with these essential workforces, we need to bring them in with us, and we need to work directly with them. And I would love to see what conversations come out at a board level with those with a cross industry, cross community leadership model. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. But
thank you. You are an essential truth teller, Anna. But yes, absolutely. Truth telling needs to be our game. Kylie Bracknell, what does a radical rethink of WA performing arts look like for you, or just look like in general?
Kaya ngayon court karaba nyin karejin bolala nganang demongar korlong ba alejamur demongar korlong bala kwap nyondiak karejin japoja. My heart is always connected to this place in a way that everything I do is not compartmentalized. And I've loved listening to all of you speak and share your thoughts with passion, nervousness, excitement, fear, though optimistic, full of optimism. As I travel this pathway that's set out for me in this current lifetime, I constantly reflect, listen, grow, learn, and question what my life mission is, all the while aspiring to not conform to compartmentalization. It is a very difficult thing to do in this time and age, I suppose. I sit here quite emotional, but not emotionally in the way that I expected to be. I sit here quite emotional because I have listened to all of you speak, and I can hear the connectedness. I can also feel it, albeit through a screen. And I feel the reflection in each of you, and I feel the ears and their truth in action. I feel the growth, and I certainly pick up on the learning and the self-reflection. What is our life mission, individually but collectively? Now, in terms of Anna's comment about boards and people who sit on those boards, or the professions of medical experts and so forth, they would not be able to practice their essential service practice without creators. Now, it took inventors and creative people to create all of the devices required to be an essential worker. And it baffles a lot of my people, and you guys are my people too, as to why in 2020 these things are not common sense. Creators are the bee's knees. Creators are the big picture thinkers. They are the most fragile energy forces and souls that you will come across. There are a lot of people who don't like talking in this way because they feel, and I am one of them, that we cannot answer these big questions so concisely and precisely. The other thing that I reflect on from my people is that individualism was not a thing. You know, those words of justice, respect, and kindness. They are some of the essential pillars of our very existence as a people, not a person, not an individual, not an award-winning or whatsoever, but as a people, that togetherness. I've got a mural on my wall behind me in my house. We bought a bit of our land back. We're working collaboratively with the bank to pay that off. I also have a really lovely reserve at the front, so I'm looking up to seek inspiration from nature. Something that all human beings do, whether you are an essential worker or not. You tend to take a holiday, and where do you go? Back to nature. Anyhow, something that I would love to see, and maybe I am avoiding the actual question, but I think it's a wonderful question, and they're all fantastic, optimistic, positive, amazingly constructed female force, future productivity, all of these lovely English words or you know, English claimed words that we can gravitate towards. I think about what worked. You know that saying, if it ain't broke. What have we really honoured in our past? What has worked? We're sitting here, all of us. What's our expiry date? When do they put us in the ground? Into this buja, ngala buja, the very place that's going to cradle us and nurture us. But think back 5, 6, 10 generations. Who are those people? How have they influenced us? What are their names? Where are they enshrined in our performing arts world? Here, from this place. Who are they? Yeah, my name is Kylie Bracknell. Before that I was Kylie Farmer. Before that I was Kylie Winmar. Before that I was Kylie Farmer. It's just a name. Kylie Bracknell is the name that I've been using that was given to me when I was in my adolescent years. And I suppose being entrusted and mentored to hold knowledge and to share knowledge and to work with woke people to care for that and share that in a way where it would help create change. The word radical just makes me smile. Why do we get to a point where we have to be so radical about things? Why can't we look at the brilliance of the David Yunai era, you know, the Aboriginal guy that invented the shears? He's that follower on the $50 note. These creators, and I don't like singling out people's names. I want us to remember that it takes a people. And the word leadership was mentioned, the word relationships was mentioned. I loved the way all of you have spoken. It shows me that in a way we don't need hope because everything's there. Everything's in motion. It's happening. The one word that I do want to touch on a little more than what Claire did was responsibility. Now, the responsibility back in the day that I've watched, learned from, listened to of my senior people is that they know if they're in a particular role of leadership that there is a great responsibility that is tied to that. It is not about individualism. It is about a collective. It is about your contribution in collaboration with or for something or someone that pushes us forward or brings us together. I always gravitate back to what worked for our mob because it did, it worked. And there are a lot of fractures. I'm going to leap to Hecate right now and say that the reason why that worked is because we took the years necessary to not only engage or develop, but be real, just be real. Bring people in, work as a people, as a collective. Invest. It's as much about investment as it is about establishing relationships, engaging community. And the other challenge that I put out to everyone is, what is your vernacular? What language are you choosing every day? What language are you feeding yourself? What language are you using? What language are you delivering? What language are you speaking? What language are you singing? There are a lot of listeners out there, and my people are smart because they listen a lot. The more you listen, the more you learn. Heck, it was about bringing people together to feel, just to feel. Those feelings that were felt will last a lot longer than reading something that touched you, and I don't want this to sound competitive in any way. I just want to bring it back to being with each other and feeling what is important in this space. I probably shouldn't talk too much longer, but some of the things that inspired me whilst holding on to that question is, I think we really need to, as an arts community, interrogate what performing arts actually is. We all need to collectively interrogate, what is the performing arts? Who does it serve? Who does it reward? How does it contribute to a more harmonious community? How do we care for our performers? How do we care for the people that have given us so much? Why aren't these current Australian news headlines saying national treasure racially abused at public transport centre? What is our perspective? How do we nurture and hold our creators, our givers, the people that inspire and motivate us to continue to connect and care? Those pillars, justice, respect, kindness, they are the embodiment of our people. They are the embodiment of the arts people and the creators and inventors, motivators, caretakers, custodians. What are we doing to do that? I mean, the hip hop movement, they didn't need any government funding. They didn't need any, it's just, they did it. They got out there and did it. Something I'd like to see is, I don't have all the answers. I've been thinking about the WAAPA mob quite a bit as well. But I also go a little earlier than that into the demographic of children who are at risk, who come from suburbs and backgrounds where they don't get access to the arts like they should have. Our children, when they're born, they are the arts brilliers. They're the brillier. They come out crying. They come out developing speech, and we listen intently and we encourage that. They do abstract art. They work with lines. They're connecting to a realm and something that somehow during adolescent years we become numb to. We feel like we need to push everything up into our intellect and yundiak. I'd love to see a better connection to young children. It brought me to the thought of how I started out in theatre. I was doing children's theatre. I just feel like there are so many points of disconnect, and maybe it's not about us talking to each other to improve that. Maybe it's about us being together, actually in action, being together to improve, sustain and maintain that, so we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. The other thing I'd love to see is a museum or a place where we can celebrate the history of performing arts here. Something just for performing arts that we can look at and celebrate over the time, that documents the things that work. To celebrate what we feel. I'm just a part in this thing that in the circle. I'm just one part of this circle. And so I often feel like I say no to a lot of these things sometimes, because to me, it's not so much about answers, but it is a lot about our actions and every day, not just if we're in a role of AD or we're performing on stage. It's what do you live and breathe? Because a lot of artists do that constantly. They're living and breathing. And we really need to consider how we nurture them, because quite often they're the ones that are talking to the old people that end up dying. They're the ones that are doing all of the behind the scenes documenting that we're not doing formally enough to catch up. And I don't want to see us having to keep playing catch up. And it does come back to what we value as a community, and choosing the right vernacular to describe that constantly, and not using words or things that take the value away or the worth away, but really living and breathing that encouragement, connect, and the celebratory feel. And I really feel that we're there. We just need to keep connected and moving the pieces in a way where it supports that, so that our people, the numbers within our people, increase the right way, so that change is balanced out in responsibility, intergenerational too, from children right up to senior people. If they have responsibility, they're going to want to proudly fulfill their role. But a lot of the time people don't feel included, and they don't feel like they're given an opportunity to hold responsibility autonomously. Maybe that's too deep, I don't know, but they're just some of the thoughts that come from my court. I tend to not write things too much. I like to listen and respond. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Kylie. Thank you, everyone. I want to end on just some final words, if you would like to. We're hearing a lot about listening and honouring and respect, value, kindness. Does anyone want to add some final thoughts, hopes and dreams? Is it too much to ask? Well, then I will. So I want to see relationships grow in unlikely places, across sectors, across funding tiers, intergenerationally, across ecologies, human and the more than human. I want to see intersection of crises matter to people in charge. And there's so many crises, so many people fearing. And I want to see the dismantling of systemic discrimination. And I want people to understand that all of these things are interconnected. And I want our performing arts sector to lead this. I'm ridiculously hopeful. Well, you know why I want that? Because we tell stories, and stories can create change, and they can be transformative, and they can heal. I also really want leadership where we can come together like this in a spirit of generosity, of kindness, to listen. And we've heard this a lot today. It's just about how much we need to listen to each other. Healthy relationships are entirely dependent on listening. So we can build relationships, build collaborations, make art together. I hope that we've done just a little bit of that today. I hope we can grow that and we can have more discussions. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone.